Matt Armstrong-Barnes. Great, we were just having a little catch up. Great to see
Yeah,
you again. What I would say, Matt, is having known you for a few years now, who do you want in a room when you've got a really important program, a really difficult, complex thing to a set of outcomes to achieve for a customer? Matt, you're on that list of people I would want in a room if I work for a big company, which I don't. I work for
thank
myself
you very
these
much.
days.
Thank you very much.
So, Matt, Group Practice AI Practice Director at Servita. So,
Yes.
welcome to the podcast. Please give everyone a little introduction, and then we'll get into it today.
Yeah, cool. Awesome to be here, firstly. Always enjoy our chats. And so, yes, so I've been in Servita for nearly 6 months now, leading their global AI practice. Prior to that, I was Hewlett Packard Enterprise, which is where we met, where I was CTO for AI for nearly 10 years. So loads of experience in the space, lots of experience delivering complex transformations, having the strategy conversation right the way through into, academically, I'm a conference paper reviewer for a specific conference at Cambridge University. So I've got loads of experience, both in terms of the bleeding edge research side, practical delivery experience, and really helping organizations get going on the AI journey or accelerating initiatives that they've already got deployed.
Yeah, no, brilliant, brilliant, Matt. And I'm going to embarrass you slightly now because I was reading your bio and it is really good. Now, then I was like, well, once I'd read this, I was like, oh, actually, yeah, that's why Matt's so good. But let me just read this. Matt is a chartered engineer with an MSc in artificial intelligence, a BSc in computing science. He's a fellow of both the Institute of Engineering and Technology and the British Computer Society, published author, technical reviewer for the Cambridge-hosted International Conference on AI, specialising in deep learning and large language models. So, Matt, no one can criticise us for not getting learned guests on AI Outcomes show, right?
Yeah, but you know me, I've got some very strong opinions. I've been doing this stuff for a long time on what works, what doesn't work, how to be successful, common problems that I've seen across multiple AI engagements over the years. And I mean, my background is large, mega scale, millions of lines of code of apps dev before transitioning into the AI space over 10 years ago. So I really find we've seen this mass of people moving in. And actually, what we need to do is make sure that we're getting some of those core learnings to make it successful, because we're starting to see some of the cracks appear in organizations who haven't got the right foundations in place to help them get going on the journey in the right way.
Yeah, and look, we covered the MIT State of AI and Business report on last week's show, actually, with Rickard
Right.
Hansen. He's a 40 years in coding and now has a company doing all that vibe coding stuff. And yeah, keen to get your perspective on it. I mean, it did say that 95% of AI POCs are ending in failure. I'm not sure I believe the failure rate's that high. It's never that simple. But look, we're here to help customers on that AI journey who don't have JP Morgan's to whatever billion a year AI budget. But you just mentioned foundation stones, Matt. What would you say the core foundation stones are need to be in place?
So I would always say, start with a plan, a strategy. What are you going to do with this stuff? Loads of people run in and they'll pick up a use case and they'll go, right, okay, great. I've got this use case. How am I going to deploy it? Firstly, don't do AI unless you've got a good handle on your data. And secondly, we've seen the MIT report was talking about generative AI, not AI. And that's a common misconception that people have, is they're both the same. They're not. To give you a very quick definition, artificial intelligence is about using algorithmically driven techniques to find hidden patterns in data. Generative AI is around the creation of digital assets. So they're doing different things. There is overlap between them because fundamentally they're both reliant on the same underlying techniques, but really we should be thinking about how we're going to tackle the AI and Gen AI problems differently. By having a plan that starts off with data as your underlying foundation and builds on top of that, it allows you to focus where data meets business process. And if where data meets business process is a problem and it is tackleable by AI, that's an AI initiative. If you're just randomly picking use cases and rushing into trying to deploy them, of course you're not going to be able to realize the benefit, which is what the MIT report says, because you got no idea whether or not it was a problem in the first place. I always talk about, if you're going to do AI, make sure you know what the benefit is going to be that you're going to derive from it. Now then, if you're going to track a benefit, you need to do it in a way that is repeatable, because anything that is measurable, you need to be able to repeat it. And if you're going to repeat it, it needs to be automated. Meaning, some of the other foundational steps you need to put in your AI initiatives are, how are you going to do it in a repeatable way, especially when you're talking about probabilistic mathematics, not deterministic mathematics. So if you always want the same output, the same outcome, use a deterministic technique. If you want an outcome that is spotting patterns or generating things using creativity, then you need to use a probabilistic technique. So I'm finding lots of people who are using the right tool, because AI and Gen AI are both tools in your toolbox. They're using the wrong tools for the job. They're not tracking the benefits, which is why the MIT report said 95% of generative AI projects fail to realize the benefit.
So that's the really useful set of definitions. And I love that you've included in there business process, because viewing any transformation program just as technology means you're losing sight on the business process, which is where the benefit will be realized within any organization. And then I love your repeatable step. It's got to be repeatable. If it's measurable, it's repeatable. What are the practical steps that a company who has kind of siloed data platforms today, and probably a bit of cloud, probably some small data center capacity, and I guess some SaaS systems that they're subscribing to, where do people start just generally on that data journey to get that all set and kind of ready to go?
So if I'll answer that in a slightly different way, which is, how to get started on going on the AI journey. And actually, you need to kick off 6 work streams, 6 pieces of work. And they will depend on size, depending on the level of organization, but most organizations need to do them. So right at the top level, you need to work out, what's my business case? What's my operating model? How am I going to be organizationally going to structure myself? Who's going to be involved in team AI? What's my AI strategy? What benefits am I going to derive from doing this kind of thing? You then need a couple more, which are, as I said, there's a difference between AI and Gen AI. They actually have different life cycles. So you say, I need to kick off an AI work stream and a Gen AI work stream. And you can wrap squads around this or however you want to do it. Next, you need a data work stream. Then you need a technology work stream. And lastly, you need a people work stream. If you kick off all of these are going to get all of the relevant things in place that you need that are going to be successful. So, for example, who owns this stuff? How do I ensure that I've got access to the data that I need with the right variety, with the right velocity, with the right veracity, the 5 V's from big data? Because if I don't make sure that my data is of high enough quality and usable by AI systems, then I'm going to get the age-old adage, which is rubbish in, rubbish out. And what does the problem with rubbish in, rubbish out in the AI world mean? It's going to do it a lot faster and at higher volume, meaning you're going to make a lot more mistakes a lot quicker. So having to make sure that your data is in the right kind of quality and the right locations for you to use with AI systems is critical. Because what are AI systems? Algorithms. What are algorithms? Mathematical equations. So I need to take my data and make it ready for being used by a mathematical equation. When it comes to generative AI, a lot of that stuff is done for you because we're dealing with tokens. So I can transform my information in a much more transparent way to interact with language models, but fundamentally there's still transformation that's happening. And as we know, if you put a bad query into a large language model supported by bad data, it's going to give you a bad outcome. So make sure that you're dealing with, you've got your data in the right kind of quality, in the right locations, with the right class distribution. For other people, that's bias. to making sure I'm mitigating bias. And both in the AI world and the Gen AI world, if you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, throwing more hay on the stack does not make it any easier. So don't think about throwing all of your data at these problems because in academic terms, you hit what's known as the curse of dimensionality, which means you've got too much data that is hidden in all of the other data. So you need to do some analysis to work out what actually is going to add me some value. By doing all of that analysis, you'll start to get an understanding at a granular level of the data that you've got. And then by virtue of doing, that'll tell you which use cases are best to execute, map those against the real business problem, and bingo, you've got a successful AI or Gen AI deployment.
So it's almost like taking your organizational vision. These are the outcomes for our business that we would like to do better at. For example, it might be customer services, it might be deliveries, it might be, it's not just going to be the efficiency. And I think that's where a lot of people thought, well, efficiency means I can just automate people out the business. It's probably not going to be that, not just yet. But having a clear vision for where a part of your business wants to get to, a business outcome, and then go, well, what data do we use today to achieve that business outcome, and how can we make that better, rather than trying to pick a whole new set of business outcomes? Is that a sort of logical place that you're seeing some of your customers start at?
I think, and it's great that you've talked about transformation as well, because you have to bear in mind, I see a lot of automation that you've sprinkled a bit of large language model into and it's suddenly become transformational. Well, it hasn't unless you've done the people bit, which is how do I make sure that this technology is successfully deployed? So it is all about finding that right outcome that you're trying to drive. I've seen organizations do it in two ways. One is, which is to create something completely new and work out how they're going to bring it in. The other one is to do the transformation of what they've already got. Dropping any form of AI or Gen AI without wrapping it in a larger change program is not going to set you up for success. And this is one of the challenges that we see, which is why so many AI projects are failing to move out of pilot, because you have something great, but when you try and work out how and where you're going to fit it into your business, that's when it becomes much more complicated. And we also need to bear in mind that we're dealing with a technique that is probabilistic, which means it gets it wrong. So we need some of that validation in there to make sure that we understand where it's going wrong, why it's going wrong, and how we take corrective action. Now, the level of it going wrong is decreasing. It's actually quite small probabilities at the minute because of the way the technology has been evolving, but it's still there. So we have to bear in mind when we're deploying this type of stuff, what level of risk are we willing to take? So don't tackle your riskiest, most complicated business processes. Look at ones where you can achieve some operational efficiency by making the people who are working in those processes more efficient. And that's really where we've seen probably the biggest successful deployments, which is either here's a lot of data, help people focus in on the most important side of it with some of the algorithmic driven techniques to spot hidden patterns in data, or by making people more productive by understanding something that they're generating that can be done automatically, that they then just become an editor instead of a creator.
Yeah, and those opportunities are across the business, really, aren't they? When you think about how good a large language model is when you're just using, say, a chat GPT or one of the others, they're so useful. And think about the application of that in the business is helpful. And then, of course, and so you might have a use case there that you think, actually, we could really take some of the work off this team of people if they had a large language model that was doing a bunch of this stuff with our data, and you were the first person to explain RAG to me in a way that made real sense, probably about 18 months ago now. So thank you for that. We'll circle back on RAG. And then, yes, the AI is, I love that point you made. Hadn't really considered that. Don't expect it to get something right 100% of the time. And we had one CEO on this podcast who gave a great example perhaps of that, which was introducing AI voice into customer services to take out of hours calls.
Yeah.
And so it worked really well. The customers were giving it great feedback, but the AI was making judgment calls in a small number of cases around cancellations and stuff. And it was going very strict on the policy, obviously.
Yeah.
But the customer services team were like, yeah, but we wouldn't have made that final call in that way like the AI did. So how they tweaked it was they just pulled the AI back and not have it make a final call on whether a customer can cancel or not. Because they're calling up in the night for these bookings, a holiday company booking. The reason they're calling in the night is because something's gone wrong in their worlds, right?
Yeah.
And they got the AI rather to stack a prioritized list of these calls for the customer services agent to deal with first when they got in that day. And so that's just that's probably exactly what you're talking about there, Matt, where the AI it wasn't necessarily getting it wrong, but it wasn't doing exactly what they would have done as humans in the loop.
And I think that's a great example. A couple of my favorite phrases, you might well have heard me talk about these before. One is AI is not one and done. You don't just deploy it and leave it. You have to make sure that you're on top of it, you're understanding what it's doing, and much in the same way. So people make mistakes. Normally, we'll have some wrap around that, some governance to understand what went wrong. We need to do exactly the same with AI, hence having this repeatability, because it's a technology, you can repeat it. So in the scenario at UK, what they've done is they've made some changes and then they've gone through a repeatable process to do a redeployment. So make sure that my other favorite phrase is AI is a journey, not a destination. So don't view it as the fact that you arrive and go, we've deployed it, that's it, successful. We never need to look at it again. Because you need to be constantly, the AI landscape is changing so frequently, you've got to be on top of this stuff. And secondly, in understanding that it's a journey, you need to have some skill in-house. I see a lot of organizations who are having AI done to them. So don't do that. Have some capability. But also, if you look back at the original MIT report that talks about 95% of Gen AI projects failing, what the report actually says is bringing in a partner who has delivery excellence in this space is more than a 2 times multiplier for success. So absolutely, something I've talked about for 5 or 6 years now is team AI. Make sure that you have the right people in your AI team, including partner delivery organizations who've got a successful track record in helping you go successfully on the journey. And again, these are massive success factors when it comes to driving successful initiatives and making sure that you've got that repeatability built into what you're deploying. And this is organizations of any size, whether or not you are a large retail bank or whether or not you're a small to medium-sized enterprise. It's all about having that right skill and having a relationship with a delivery partner who leaves you skilled up around what you've deployed.
Yeah, and I want to focus a bit on team next. So we've discussed data, and before we leave data, I'd just like you to explain for the audience's benefit RAG, because that was one of the critical moments for me. It was like, I was like, well, surely you take a chat GPT, you get your instance of it and just let it rip in your organization. You were like, yeah, but the chat GPT doesn't know about you and your business in a commercial world. It needs something called RAG. And Matt, give everyone the benefit of your explanation of RAG, please.
Yeah, okay. I know we'll come back and talk about ChatGPT's evolved, I think, since we probably talked about RAG last. So the way I describe it is, and this is to describe it in a simplistic way, so there are some subtle differences, just for my disclaimer. So if you think about it, you want to have an interactive conversation with your data. But obviously it's in a very unstructured way. It's scattered around. What I want to do is take my data and put it into a knowledge store. And I want to have an interactive conversation with that knowledge store. Unfortunately, the best and most efficient way of doing that is to put it into a knowledge store that actually doesn't speak a language. So what I can do is I can put a language model that understands language. So I chat with the language model. The language model interacts with my knowledge store and does the translation for me. The knowledge store provides the answers back to the language model, which then translates it back to me. Some of the core benefits I get is in my knowledge store, I can have a link back to where that data originated from. So I get that explainability. So I get fewer hallucinations, which is the language model making things up, because I can validate the responses I'm getting from the language store by going to the section of the document in my repository where that information came from. And that's how I take my data in a very unstructured way and I put it into this knowledge store. It's really, I won't go into the fact that it's a vector database, but that's kind of how it works. Incidentally, what we've seen is a slight change to that. So RAG was very, very popular, probably, and still is a very successful means of deploying on-prem. What we've seen that's happened in the OpenAI world is they've increased what's known as the context window. So now I can take a lot of my data and put it into a very large context window. So that means I can take documents and I can combine them with my chat so that as a result, I'm having a very large context window. And that's the OpenAI model, which is they're trying to make their context window larger and larger and larger. Some complexity with that, which is there's a different cost of input tokens and output tokens. So actually throwing in lots of context is a fairly cheap way of doing it because input tokens being cheaper. Google with Gemini are taking a different, so they've got the Google Titan architecture, which has 3 memory types. They've got a long-term memory, a short-term memory, and a task-based memory. So we're sort of seeing these 3 different approaches to managing generative AI techniques with my data. So depending on whether or not you are dealing with Google's Titan architecture, OpenAI's very large context window, or a desire to deploy something on-prem that has a smaller context window but needs this knowledge store, are key reasons why you need a strategy. Which one of these architects are you going to choose, because they're quite different architecture approaches about how you're handling the data that you're adding in to mean that I can have a conversational relationship with my underlying unstructured and structured data.
Yeah, that's a real big change that actually we've seen just as regular users of, say, ChatGPT, is you can drag files in, create I've got all these projects created where I've said, hey, come back and get these files. I've said, can you answer for this project? Can you answer as if you're an expert in this or that or the other? And so so and that's the context window. I had not realized that's what that was. And then I guess no sooner have you done that than someone's going to say, well, hey, are we compliant with GDPR? Where's our data going when it's on ChatGPT or Gemini? What's the challenges around compliance, Matt?
The compliance landscape is evolving very quickly. The EU AI Act, which I've blogged around quite extensively over the past couple of years, that's driving any organization that wants to do something with AI with an EU member state quite significantly. Biden-Harris administration submitted some executive orders. Obviously, the Trump administration is changing that in the US with some very big AI announcements. In the UK, we have a pro-innovation agenda, which means that we don't have a lot of regulation that's wrapped around this stuff. So it's a very complicated landscape. I think when it comes to thinking about your AI strategy, what you're going to do, getting into the granularity of your data helps you understand which pieces of this legislation is going to affect it. So if you want to build an algorithm and deploy it for an EU member state, you need it to be compliant with the EU AI Act, which is which is a risk-based approach based around what you're trying to deploy. There are certain prohibited categories. There are certain low-risk categories that you can deploy. but you need to go through a compliance checklist associated with that. So it does add this. Compliance is definitely a complex, ever-moving landscape. If you've got that granular understanding of the data that you're using, it allows you to make informed decisions about which types of algorithms you're going to use, whether or not you can use ChatGPT, whether or not you can use Gemini, whether or not you have to go with an on-prem deployment. All of these considerations are quite critical. Too many organizations are rushing into it. I speak to quite a lot of organizations and ultimately find out they're using their personal ChatGPT accounts, and you're a bit like, oh, hang on a second here. So having a bit of a policy that says, okay, what can you use these services for and what can't you is critical, because banning them, a lot of the time, that just means that people will engineer their way around them, because these tools are for automating people's lives and making things better. And if that's the case, they'll try mechanisms to use them unless you're giving them the tools that they need that are compliant with the regulation related to the data that you're using.
So it's almost like a starting point might be that you are going to, and I'm just competing with a bit of background noise here. So, but a starting point would be, let's create our own in-house large language model, given that if we don't, people are just going to be copying and pasting stuff outside of the company systems and into their personal Gemini or Chat GPT, is for not for the super secure customers, but for just like regular businesses. Is that what they're doing? They're just like, we're just going to get one of these models, and that's going to be our in-house flavor. Is that what's happening, Matt?
I think we're seeing a few things. One is we're seeing sovereign-based deployments of a variety of language models. So everyone's heard of, the likes of Claude, of ChatGPT, of Gemini. There are lots and lots of very good open source models that you can bring down and deploy in a fairly straightforward way into your environment. You can actually build out RAG implementations in a fairly straightforward fashion. You do need some technical expertise around how you're going to do that. So we're seeing this sort of spectrum of, so people are not building models because they're incredibly expensive to build. Very few organizations are fine tuning, which means I'll take some of my data and actually train it into the model myself. Because a number of organizations might start to think around that way, and then they look at the computational costs associated with it and find out that it's quite prohibitive. So they'll go into the inference, which is how I take an open source model and deploy that locally and then make use of my data. If you don't want to do that, there's a number of sovereign organizations that you can engage with that will give you a local deployment, in the UK, for example, or in our borders from a compliance perspective, and give you access to an API. Underneath that is a scalable language model that you can use. And then right the way through up into, right, okay, what can I use with a ChatGPT or a Gemini or any of the other, an Anthropic, one of the other organizations who are kind of building out this capability. And there's also, so everyone's heard of these large language models. There's actually quite a lot of focus now on small language models, which are very domain specific. So as a result, if I'm tackling this, so for example, if I want to use a language model to write code for me, deploying something physically on-prem using what's quite expensive GPU memory, it doesn't need to speak German. So why would I take a language model that has the ability to speak all of the languages, 20 different languages, when actually I wanted to write me Python code? Do you know what I mean? So we're seeing this evolution of the smaller language models with lower floating point precision, and ultimately a smaller number of parameters that are becoming very effective and actually fairly straightforward to deploy. For example, I've got a Mac. On my Mac, I can deploy language models quite effectively. I can use them with my data. They're restricted specifically to my laptop, and so I can use them extensively with any data I want to. And because I'm using an open source model, and then I've wrapped it with a number of other open source frameworks that make it fairly easy to use.
Yeah, and so all of these options exist. I guess people just don't, you wouldn't naturally know about that, all of the different options. The more you go away from just using one of the big models up in their giant cloud, and you're going to go on a curve of, yes, we're more and more compliant, but it's going to cost us more. So that brings us all the way back to the start of this conversation, which is the requirement for a business case to do
Yep.
anything in a
Yep.
business. And then that gets you onto, I guess, two other subjects which we should cover. So you've mentioned the governance, the team on the
Yep.
customer's side that's required to do this, adopt AI successfully, and I guess respond to changes in the market, because the market's just going to continue changing with rapidity. And maybe we can go there, and then let's go there next in this conversation. What you're seeing works really well, and then the ecosystem of partners. Because if this stuff was easy and you could just, I'm being pitched AI agents the whole time because I'm a business owner. If it was just as easy as me just clicking on and subscribing to an AI agent, then there wouldn't be an industry of partners. And you need trusted partners who really understand your business if they're going to be good partners for you in this space. But you are going to need that ecosystem of partners. But let's just go to the team on the customer side. What does that need to look like, Matt?
So I view Team AI as including the ecosystem, because you need people from a variety of different skill sets. So, for example, probably to gather, I'm more a data scientist. So when it comes to data, actually, a lot of the data that I'm using, I'll have to translate into ways that algorithms can use. So I'm tokenizing it, or I'm turning it into ones and zeros, So for me, I don't necessarily have the domain expertise associated with the value of the data. So for me, it's just data. And I've got loads of examples of working with organizations where me not understanding the data or engaging with the domain experts in the right kind of way has not created the right outcome. So loads of battle scars thankfully from about 10 years ago, where I realized the importance of the domain expertise. Also, things like ethical considerations. So again, I'm an engineer. I do things. I get a problem, I go away and I fix it. Should I be fixing that problem is probably something that somebody else should think about. So having this diversity of thought across the team, which is, right, okay, what's the problem? Is the problem classified in the right domain sense with a good understanding of the data? So from a data, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working with an insurance company. If that insurance company works specifically with an aging population, that will change statistical distribution of the data. So I would be going, well, hang on a second, why have we got a demographic that's over here? And they say, well, actually, we sell insurance for a specific demographic, so you've got to view your distribution in a different kind of way. Having that diversity included in the team is key. You do need security, common one that people forget about. If I'm dealing with very sensitive organizational data, one could argue an organization's most valuable asset, you need to have it secured in the right kind of way. You need to have some governance and control over it. Who had the data? Why did they have it? How did they transform it? Why did they transform it? And how did they securely dispose of it? These things that you need to consider, as well as some of the technology space, because technology, a lot of this data is disaggregated out there in hyperscalers, on-prem deployments, wrapped up in databases. You need to get access to that. And even if you look at the job spec for a full stack data scientist, of which very few of these people exist, by the way, genius when it comes to understanding business problems and absolutely expert level programmers, even in that job spec, it doesn't talk about database access or how to access files on file stores. So you need some of that expertise that understands the technology landscape. Now, it might well be, you think, hang on a second, Matt, that sounds like a massive team. It might well be that people wear multiple hats. You don't need, you just need some people who understand this. So it might well be that if you're dealing with deploying of AI into your finance department, the person in finance also comes in with some of the ethical considerations, as well as understanding some of the key data that you're trying to deal with.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. Just going through those individual kind of its roles, and I totally take your point. If you look at Team AI, that some of those roles are going to be people from outside of our organization because they're
Yep.
best placed to undertake those particular roles. One thing, just I guess it's more of a culture type question for you, Matt, is so at any point, really, any of those roles can put their hand up and say, hey, yeah, it's not, we can't do it. It's not possible. Look at these risks. And it just seems to me that you need to have a team of people in the room who are culturally thinking, no, we kind of we do need to make a start on this. We don't want to cause any problems. We don't want to introduce unnecessary risks, but we do need to make a start. And lots of people that I've spoken to say that the CEO and really strong executive leadership is key in those conversations. And we used to have it in the kind of giant outsourcing partnerships that we had, where you were trying to talk about managing risk over like a 10-year period. And in the end, you needed a leader in the room to say, right, okay, we've had a good chat about this. I'm prepared that we proceed, but as long as we're measuring it in these ways and I've got these checkpoints along the way, leadership just seems critical to me. Otherwise, you just say, "Oh, we're not going to do anything." Well, let's just wait for another year, wouldn't you?
Yes, I fundamentally agree with that. I think we've got to. So I speak to loads of executive leaders, and I give the analogy of the difference between AI and Gen AI all the time, because people put them all together. And the other one is trying to get executives to understand when it's an AI problem. Because loads of them are saying, I want to do AI. I've seen CEOs say this, right? Okay, well done. We're now an AI company. Everybody must have an AI initiative. What did that create? Absolute chaos. Absolute chaos. Because everyone had an AI initiative. They were all completely separate, different processes, different tech stacks, some on-prem, some with a hyperscaler, and it created absolute chaos. So having assigned ownership with a collection of leaders who understand what's an AI problem. And if I give you some organizationally, there are three models that you can have inside an organization when it comes to AI. So number one is I'll leave all of my analysts, people understanding the data, who can do data science activities in the business, because that's where they live. And if I move them, they become one step removed away from core business problems and core data. That's one model. The other model is I'll create a center of excellence where I'll pull all of these people into one structured unit under one leader and say, right, okay, you are now delivering all of my AI initiatives. Neither of those two approaches work, because if I leave all of my people working on AI initiatives, I create this chaos because they don't share information. They work on specific tech stacks. AI tech stacks are expensive. And suddenly I've got them in different hyperscalers. I've got some on-prem deployments. I've got this mess. Pulling it into a center of excellence, you hit the challenge that you've articulated, which is you don't actually do anything. They spend all their time thinking about stuff and never doing it. And they are also one step removed from the data. So the model that works is a hub and spoke approach. So you have some ownership, some centralized governance, some centralized sharing of best practices, some centralized control over the tools that are used, and then you leave the people who are interacting with the data and building the models out in the organization. Now, you might say, well, hang on a second. Again, this is large organizational thinking, which is, I have this. If I'm a smaller organization, how am I going to have it working? When I've worked with smaller organizations, you have a tendency that everyone knows each other. So you end up creating more virtual teams. So you have this virtualized central function, and you have people who are working on initiatives, and just because you need the sharing of best practice, sharing of common tools, and sharing of governance to make sure that you're allocating the right resources to the AI projects that are going to be successful.
Yes, quite, and and it changes by the nature of your organization, doesn't it? And that and I love what you said about center of excellence. That center of excellence was the best practice, wasn't it? It's create the center of excellence, and it's like, well, yeah, it didn't go anywhere. We didn't actually do anything. We just got lots of
Yeah.
POCs, but nothing got put out there into the wild, as I say, into the production environment. And so we didn't achieve the business outcome. So there's lots of different ways to approach it depending on what type of business you are. And I guess one of the best types of business to be would be a startup. So you don't have all the legacy challenges.
Yeah.
It's like, right,
Yeah.
it's nice and new. I can just then take your pick on your AI agents, I guess, and spin it all up really quickly. What just coming up to the last few minutes, Matt, and it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. I've learned a ton, as I'm sure everyone has listened to this podcast. What about people fear of AI taking job roles? Is that causing the air brakes to go on in some instances? What are you seeing out there in the market?
I think any organization that isn't educating people around what it is, because there's still lots of myth and misunderstanding about what you can actually do. And so it's about education. Secondly, the cat is out of the bag. We could probably do a whole podcast on the AI bubble and what that means. But it's an available technology. It's something that people can deploy. And the higher skill level you give everybody in the organization, your higher retention chances are going to be, because we're moving into an algorithmically driven space. It's where we need to get to because we need to operate at a different level of pace. People who are AI skilled, and I don't need programming it in Python or understanding how all of the different algorithms work. That's why you need people like me. But what you do need is to have an understanding of what type of problems it can tackle. And as a result, spot when AI is going to be an effective tool to pull out of the toolkit. And by having that knowledge, you also understand when it's not working effectively. So by skilling up everybody in your organization to make them AI aware is absolutely going to tackle some of the organizational challenges. Because again, lots of organizations that ran at use cases, they picked a use case, they deployed a use case, they didn't educate people around it, and they'll have worked out how to avoid using the AI.
Yeah.
We've seen this in lots of IT change programs in the past. Unless you embrace the fact that this is a bigger set of changes that I'm trying to successfully implement, ultimately not going to be successful.
Yeah, and I think the way you do that is by making people's lives easier who are
Yeah,
working for you in your company, and take away the mundane, take away the problems, take away the chores that people don't like doing. And education, everybody who's come onto the podcast has said education, communication, education,
yeah,
that is a continuous process with your team to take away the fear, but just as it's you don't need to worry about AI taking your job, but somebody using AI might come along and take your job. I think it's the same for
yeah,
businesses. I think if you don't make a start, if you don't get ready, if you don't do something with AI, expect another business who's in your marketplace, who does start using these technologies and learning to
yeah.
use them effectively. Expect them to come on and disrupt you. That's just logical that would happen. So, but yeah, you need that AI team, Matt, and yeah, anyone listening to this, Matt, you'd be the one of the top people to come into my AI team, that's for sure. So, no, Matt, it's been fascinating talking to you today, and just learning point after learning point, which is what AI outcomes as a podcast is all about. So, really, thank you very much, Matt. Where do people find you, mate?
Good place is LinkedIn. I do get lots of LinkedIn requests. It'd be great if people could put in there why they want to connect, which you've never heard us chat today. That'd be awesome. I try to write something every week about some of the things that are happening in the AI space. Having been a prolific blogger for most of my career, I'd continue that with regular LinkedIn updates. So yeah, definitely a good place.
Yeah, no. So everybody, I will put in the show notes. I'll put your LinkedIn, any blog, anything like that. Just We'll put all of that in the show notes. But yeah, I highly recommend everybody to sign up to Matt. Reach out to him. You've been a brilliant person, Matt. So thank you very much for coming on AI Outcomes. Really enjoyed the discussion today. I learned so much. So as always, talking to you. So thank you very much. Let's wrap it up there, shall we?